truth, love. Like each one of those elements is important. Some of us like to clam up, go into silent mode. Some of us like to speak, but maybe not always truth or in love. And so putting all of those together to speak the truth in love is how Paul is really kind of defining what maturity in the body of Christ looks like. Doesn't mean, I don't think he's saying that we all have to see things exactly alike, but how do we talk to each other in a mature way? And we're going to talk about each one of those elements this week, and speaking, how do we speak to each other? Speaking the truth and doing so in love. And so we like to think of this sometimes as being, so often we're kind of soft on issues, right? Like, we forget what we're even upset at the other person about. We just know that we're upset at the other person. And we get really hard on other people. And we like to kind of flip that around to where instead we're kind of hard on the issues. These are the things that we're really talking about. How do we talk about these things? But then we're kind of soft on people. Like we understand that people are coming from different perspectives. So that's kind of the lead-in to this evening. This idea, this kind of sets the tone for this weekend. I'd like to just pause for a word of prayer before we go any further. Creator God, we're grateful for this time, for these people, and all of us that were able to gather like this this evening and tomorrow to talk about your work and how do we talk about that together in a mature way, in a way that builds up the body, that unites the body. We ask for your Spirit's presence here among us, that we would be humble, that we would be gentle with each other, we'd be patient as we seek to hear from you. In Christ's name. So just a little bit of an idea of what we're going to be doing tonight. I'm going to really try to keep my eye on the clock. I don't like going long. I like to stay on track. So I'll be glancing at my clock. So the first part from about 7 o'clock to 8:15, we're going to be talking about the nature and role of conflict. How do we think about conflict? And then we'll spend a little bit of time, what does the Bible, especially the New Testament, have to say about conflict? That'll take us to 8:15. And in all of that, we're going to have a lot of time to interact with each other. You really don't want to listen to me all weekend. You'll get much more out of it if you're talking to each other. So at 8:15, we'll take a 15-minute break. Actually, it'll be a little bit longer than that because I'm going to be giving you an assignment over break. And then we'll come back and we'll start working at understanding your own style of response to conflict. So that's kind of the agenda for tonight. Tomorrow we'll be looking at, we'll be continuing this idea of understanding how we approach conflict. And then we'll also be looking at interpersonal peacemaking skills. We'll really be, during that time, focusing on the role of language and how we talk to each other, and even how the words that we choose to use, how they affect how we think about conflict. So what we're really trying to do this weekend is flip our views of how we think about conflict. And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll really be working at how does conflict show up in a congregation? How do we work at it together? So that's kind of a quick overview of tonight and a little bit of tomorrow. I'll go over in more detail in the morning. So this first section, we're going to be trying to talk about understanding conflict. What is conflict transformation? And and so you can ask the question, why do we even study conflict? Like, you know, a lot of us just kind of like to put it, you know, under the rug and not paying attention to it. But as we begin to think about conflict, it helps us improve our relationships with our families, maybe our romantic relationships, our relationships in the workplace, and then also our relationships with each other in the community and the church. And it also gives us, allows us to kind of avoid some destructive habits that we maybe carried with us from a very early age, and we'll spend a bit of time talking about that, and be able to help us to develop some interpersonal peacemaking skills. And then how do we come together as a church to agree when there might be differences on how we view things? So those are some reasons that we like to think it's important to study conflict. Like, people don't like to talk about conflict, but how do we why do we even spend time studying it? So right away, we're going to get some chance to move around here. Back just on this side of the food table, I guess I'll just call it the food table for lack of a better word, I have 10 pieces of tape marked out, from 1 on that side to 10 on this side. And I want each of you to imagine that you are embroiled in a conflict and somebody is really angry at you. And you're not just a neutral bystander, you're involved in it. And I want you to complete this sentence. When someone is angry with me, what do you do? How would you like to respond? So think about that, like on the one end, like you just want to avoid it. You want to get as far away from that situation as possible. The 10, like, oh, this is great. Like, this is an opportunity. Like, yeah, let's have at it. So those are the kind of the two spectrums, two ends of the spectrum. So I want you to think.
Did anyone else lose the sound?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, and I sent a message to Stephen. Somehow
Okay.
it's going as direct messaging rather than the rest of you can see it, but he says stand by.
Okay,
Yeah, I sent a message too, but I didn't see it appear in the chat.
I'm just glad I don't have to fix anything.
Folks, sorry for the technical difficulties. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
Wonderful. So there you are. So people are in the back of the room. I think you can kind of see that in the other screen from First Presbyterian. they're on a continuum on the floor and having some conversations. We'll see if we can pick them up.
All right, so let's move to this thing like 4, 5, 6 area.
You can choose the view.
What is it you want to see?
I
You
want
want
to.
the
I want to be able to.
speaker?
I want to be able to blow up a particular image.
You are clicking on it? Okay.
It says
Oh, okay. No, we're
that's
not.
it.
So, yeah, and so that gets a little difficult to talk about tomorrow. Some people will stay in the room, right? People will be able to go, then what misunderstanding. There's never like this single. After that thing, all right. 7 to 10. I already got this. I don't know why, so kind of what there is to talk about. So when you hear the word conflict is opportunity. Yeah, so there's that. You see how the direction match. There's not stress. So we see that there's a lot of very good. And a lot of that. Not only is conflict, but why. Well, we don't need to do this. See this. So, it'll work out. So, but when we ask those people if they would maybe do it, and maybe if we get what if we just would use the word concept, and we can use words like that's not about believers. It's about the way that we see things differently. And then when we have that conversation, you know, why do you see it this way? And we begin to listen carefully. That is, listen, what you can see how it's right. Thank you. You're all going to get I Lombard. It's not a minus degree, so it's another. We have a current style profile. We're going to work through that, and that really does influence the whole message. All right. These
Why don't you just let them know if they have anything to say, they can raise their hand for the chat.
I'd just like to give an opportunity for those who are on Zoom. If you have any comments, raise your hand or put it in the chat and we'll take those comments as well. We're going to try to include you as much as we can. And if I forget about it, let Stephen know somehow so that we can get your comments in. But we definitely want to include you as much as we can. You have anything there, Stephen? No? Okay. So we already kind of ran through this a little bit. This idea of conflict is like, and we used different words, stress, opportunity. I'd like for us to think a little bit about some metaphors that you would use to describe conflict. In other words, it might be stormy. Like, what kind of metaphors would you use to describe conflict? Conflict is like a what? Anybody? Huh? A tug of war, okay. Anyone else? Yeah. A negotiation, okay. Yeah. A hurricane, okay, it's gonna raise havoc when it goes through. Okay, yeah. A roller coaster, up and down, you don't know where you're going. Yeah. Like a conflict is like a 2-year-old, okay? So it gets back to that thing Paul was talking about. Don't be like children tossed to and fro. You got a roller coaster, up and down. Yeah. A puzzle. Interesting. Why do you say a puzzle?
Because of the fact that you have to try to put the pieces together, and sometimes you just don't know where they go.
Okay, so it's like putting a puzzle together, trying to figure out what pieces go. Yeah. Conflict is a part of normal life, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and so that leads us right into this. So when we talk about conflict transformation, we begin to understand that conflict is a normal part of life. Like, you just can't avoid it. I mean, you can avoid it, but if you avoid it, you kind of step out of life a little bit almost. We need to be able to understand conflict to make our way through life. Conflict can be constructive. We've heard these ideas of it being destructive, but we also heard this idea that it's an opportunity, right? And so which is it? Is it destructive? Well, it can be destructive if we let it be, right? But it can also be constructive. And we'll get into this when we look at conflict in the Bible. We need to develop skills and strategies to manage conflict. So I need to keep moving really fast through here so we get through this early part here. So there are different dimensions of conflict. Like, conflict can kind of happen on the interpersonal level, like between a husband and wife, or between two friends. There can be relational patterns, how we relate to each other as groups, between groups, how different groups interact with each other. And conflict is also really determined how we view conflict by culture. Like, culture can affect conflict, but conflict can also affect cultural relations. So how does conflict play out across cultures? So those are just different levels of conflict, or dimensions of conflict. So what are some sources of conflict? And I just have a couple listed here. Again, we have these interpersonal relationships where we have conflict. There can be environmental conflicts, right? Like COVID. Like, that's been the source of a lot of conflict, right? It's brought things in our lives that we haven't really know how to deal with. Another one that I was thinking about, I hadn't really thought about this until today. So I avoid gluten. And a weird thing happens to me when I eat gluten. It doesn't affect my stomach or anything, but 2 days later I get very depressed. And the world just looks completely dark. And I think, like, how am I ever going to go through this? And when I think of conflict, when I'm at that stage, like, I am way down at one. It affects how I think about things, and I have to stop and as hard as I try to get out of it, I can't. I just think, like, this is the way the world is. It's just gloomy. But the next day, things are just, back to normal again. And so things like that can affect how we view conflict. So it's not always that I'm down at 1 or 4. Like, so I can move across that spectrum depending on what's happening to me personally. There can be structural or systemic disparities that create conflict between groups of people, where people feel like they're maybe not being heard. And then I think, at the heart of a lot of conflict is change and how people respond to change. Some people want to hang on to the way things have always been, and you could almost replace the word change for conflict, because back to what you said, like, conflict is normal, change is normal too, right? So those things, like, are really closely related, and how we deal or accept change. So when you step back and think about, like, why am I upset at this? Well, maybe it's just because it's bringing change, and I may not quite be prepared for that, to deal with it. And so other people are, more eager, and we'll look at that when we look at these name tags, how different people respond to the change and how that affects them. One of the things that we're just starting to think about is how conflict can take different forms. So there can be what we call extraordinary harm. And quite honestly, the Peace Center doesn't deal with this much at all, not directly. When we talk about extraordinary harms, so those are things like where there's like physical, sexual, emotional, maybe when we're talking about spiritual abuse, but when there's like really serious moral harms, that's one level of conflict. But then there's ordinary harm that, we just don't see things the same. And there was a recent article in the Mennonite Quarterly Review by Rachel Miller Jacobs, where she writes about this, and she gives this story about green beans that I really like. So for a long time, she was a stay-at-home mom, and she had young children, planted a garden, and her husband was a lawyer. And so one night, she had prepared this meal, and there was like this little can, or little leftover container of green beans left, and her husband just tossed it in the garbage. He says, how can you do that? Like, I planted those green beans, I canned those green beans, I cooked those green beans, and you just throw them away. Like, you have no respect for what I'm doing. And it's just green beans, but it was so much of who she was that she felt, and she still struggles with those green beans. So insignificant things like green beans can create, and she talks about it in terms of that we all have different matrices of meaning that our identity is built on. So if you would think about it in your table, you would all maybe have some things in common. You might all go to First Press, and you might agree about some things, but pretty soon you would also have some personal meaning that you don't share with the others around your table. And if we don't understand those differences, we could soon step on each other's meaning. And we don't even know that we're doing it. And we wonder, well, why does that person get so upset? Well, there's something really that their identity is really kind of built on. And so it gets back to this idea of like listening carefully to people. Like, why did that really, set you off when I threw the green beans away? Oh, I didn't think about that. I didn't realize that. I can understand that. So understanding where different people are coming from, like what shapes their worldview, is really important. Yeah, John. We'll talk about that tomorrow, and often I would talk about that in terms of power and powerlessness, how some people feel powerless in a congregation specifically, yeah. But we'll talk about that at length tomorrow. No, so John asked if I would define spiritual abuse. So that maybe that's not the best term, I don't know, but that's what I'm thinking about is when I'm thinking about when there's just kind of power disparities at play in a group. Doesn't have to be in a church, but where there's like differences and people feel like they're not being heard, just kind of disregarded. And we'll also talk about, like, sometimes we spiritualize conflict, and I'll say, oh, John, I'm praying for you. I don't know if that's spiritual abuse, but we spiritualize conflict, like where we say, like, and it's not that I'm really praying that we can come to an agreement, but I'm praying that you understand things the way that I understand it. That you come around to my point of view. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that, well, let's pray about this now. All right. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it kind of relates to these kind of different levels of conflict. And I apologize. You can't see that very well, but I'm kind of working with a picture here that I can't blow up as much as I'd like. But Marie Dugan talks about the nested model of conflict, that even like personal relationships are often nested in what she calls relational conflict. So maybe two groups, if you have two different groups in a setting like this, that there might be interpersonal conflict, but that might grow out of conflict between the younger generation and the older generation that don't quite see things alike. I'm just using that as an example. But then there might also be that those relational conflicts are nested in kind of structural conflicts. Maybe it has something to do with your polity that really kind of allows these relational conflicts to go on. We just worked with a church. It was an Episcopalian church. It was a group of people that felt like their leader was being really heavy-handed. He says, but we really can't do anything about it because that's the way our polity is built. Like, whatever the leader says, we have to obey it. And so their polity allowed for this kind of heavy-handedness. And so what do you do in that? So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And so then they say that, well, Dugan says, well, but then these kind of polities or structural systems are embedded in even like a societal, kind of almost a cultural system or a conflict that allows this kind of maybe patriarchy to be embedded in people's mind. And so that polity flows out of that kind of mindset. So he says, like, to work at these interpersonal conflicts, it can be helpful, but if you don't take care of these other levels, they'll just pop up again. So you have to look at these kind of deeper levels. You can deal with the relational ones, like in the moment, kind of, but these longer ones, like how are you going to change polity? that is a long process, right? And that doesn't just happen overnight. So the broader the influence, the longer it takes to kind of shift those conflicts, those larger systemic conflicts. So we also talk about different levels of conflict. Sometimes, and this is kind of related to this whole idea of like, sometimes there's a problem to solve, and you work it out. You talk about it, you get it worked out, but maybe you don't get it worked out, and it kind of moves into the next level. You begin to kind of butt heads with each other. It becomes a contest, kind of this tug of war that was mentioned. And then if it goes beyond that, it begins to become fight and flight. People either move down to 1 or up to 1, down to 10. Like, and they begin, either people begin to avoid, as we mentioned, or they really begin to just, lash out. Then it goes beyond that, then it gets into this where people are really destroying each other. Like there's name calling, those kinds of things. People are really, the issue isn't the issue anymore. The issue is that I'm trying to destroy that other person. And then it becomes intractable, where there's just no way to resolve this. People are just gone their separate ways. And so we like to use this little chart here to illustrate that. That often when at that first level, people are talking to each other, they can get things worked out. It moves to the next level, they begin to, they actually begin to talk more, and they kind of fight back and forth. But then it gets to this tipping point where they said everything that they're going to say to each other, and they don't talk to each other anymore. And it's either fight or flight. And then it gets down to the intensity increases, and it gets down to where people are really destroying each other, and then finally they just go their separate ways. So we always say once it gets to that point where it's the intensity is high, the communication is low, we try to get people to talk to each other again, get them to be able to listen to each other, to kind of draw that intensity down. And you can see this often when people begin to talk to each other. We saw this recently in a congregation or in a presbytery that we were working with. People were they were at odds with each other. And one person said, we've started to get together and talk to each other. These people that I was really at odds with, we're actually talking together and getting along with each other. So just being able to get back in the room and talk with each other can bring that intensity down to where you can get back to people having, civil conversations again. Kind of related to this is how you approach, how do you deal with conflict? And there would be other variations of this or stages in here, but so at that first level, people are negotiating. There's just two people are working things out on their own. We would call that negotiation. They're figuring out how to work things out on their own. But when it gets to that point where people are having a hard time talking to each other, then you begin the mediation process, and then partial party is brought in to kind of lead that process back to where people can talk to each other in love. And finally, if people get to this point where they're just they can't agree, then you bring the arbitrator in to just come to a decision. I don't know if there are any baseball fans in here, but you often hear when two sides, the owner and the player, can't come to a decision on a contract, they bring in an arbitrator. Whatever the arbitrator decides, whether the owner or the player chooses which, I don't know how they decide that, but they decide which is the fairest, I guess. Both sides have to agree that they're going to go with that. So that's kind of the arbitration process. So we don't really do arbitration. We don't come in and do that kind of evaluative work and say, well, you should do this or you should do that. We're more in this mediation to get people together to talk things through. So just a couple more slides on this understanding conflict. I really believe that conflict is shaped by culture, how we view and understand conflict. So for example, just the word conflict comes from the Latin word confligere, which means to strike together. So that's this idea of like butting heads, right? Like, so when we use that word, like it brings up feelings in our guts, right? Like in our gut, like this, oh, this is, we're butting heads, like it's this person against me, like we're striking together. But that's not how everyone sees conflict. That's not how every culture sees conflict. That's not a given. So for example, again, this is hard to see, but the Mandarin word for conflict is, I don't know how to pronounce it, which means danger plus opportunity. So it could be dangerous, but it's also an opportunity. So what happens if even the very word that you use to talk about differences changes, and that can change across culture. I did my graduate work in cultural anthropology, and I was, there's a book, one of my favorite books is a book by, Basso is his name. It's called Silence Sits in Places, and it talks about how the Western Apache deal with conflict and how they use silence. Or not how they use silence, how they use stories. So instead of saying, well, Roger, you need to do this or that, they'll say, Roger, remember the story? And they'll name a place, and that place has a story attached to it. And everybody in the community knows what that story is about. And so all of a sudden, that story is sitting with you, and the story goes to work on you and not the other people. And so they don't confront like we would say, well, just confront the other person. Well, that would be very offensive in Western Apache culture. In other words, what you do is you sit down and you have a conversation. At some point you say, well, remember so-and-so. That's all you say. And it brings up the whole story that goes to work on you. So just the way that we approach conflict is influenced by our culture. And it can be, conflict can be influenced by various things. I talk about gluten, that can be kind of an environmental thing. But our family of origin really plays a significant part in how we deal with conflict. I mentioned that my parents both grew up in Amish homes, and it definitely influenced how I view conflict. And there's a story that Ronald Craigville, which a lot of the material that we use in this workshop tells about an Amish bishop who came home after church, and he was sitting on his easy chair, and one of his neighbors walked in and said, you know, so-and-so over there, every time it rains, he takes his heavy equipment down the road and he messes up the road and just tears it up. Like, can't you do something about it? And the old Amish bishop, he strokes his beard and says, "Yeah, du bist recht." And the guy leaves, and pretty soon the other neighbor comes in and says, so-and-so, he's supposed to put gravel on the road, he never does that. Can't you make him put the gravel on the road like he's supposed to? And he sits back and he just strokes his beard. Yeah, du bist recht. Which means, yeah, you're right. And so his wife is listening in the background and says, "Dottie," his grandpa is, you told both of them that they're right. How can that be? He goes, yeah, du bist recht. Right, so he just doesn't want to commit to anything. And that really kind of shapes, that's not that far stretched. But really kind of, you just want to avoid conflict, you just want to maintain peace. So to do that, you just avoid it. You just agree with everyone. So our family of origin can really kind of shape how we approach conflict. I could tell more stories, and I probably will, but historical trauma can really shape the way that we approach conflict, like an incident in our lives that just triggers something later on, and we might say, well, just get over it. But it's not that easy when a person has been traumatized. It affects their bodies and their responses. So, thinking well, why does that person always respond like this in this situation? Well, it might be interesting to know what happened, in their past that might have contributed to that. And then there are cultural norms, which we've already touched on. I'm going to move on because I want to get to this next part here. But just kind of for your own benefit, think about a person or a childhood experience that really shaped the way that you view conflict or the way that you approach conflict, either negatively or positively. Maybe there was a certain experience or a certain person that you really look up to, and this is how they approached it. That really has influenced you. So just kind of on your own, as we go through this, think about who are the people, what are the experiences that have shaped the way that you deal with conflict. So I'm going to switch our focus here a little bit before break. Man, time flies. So I want to look at some observations from the Bible on what it has to say about conflict. Some of you mentioned, I don't think I got this one. I tried to go through and increase the font size of all these. It looks like I missed this slide. I usually do this on Zoom, and so it's not such a big deal, but I tried to get them all, but I think I missed this slide. The Bible is full of diversity and conflict, beginning right at Genesis 1, right? It says the earth was void and without form, and God, brings the creation out of it. There's conflict there. There's other origin stories that talk about that turmoil, that chaos at the beginning of the world that God brought order out of. So this idea of it's an opportunity goes way back to the creation story. Conflict is an opportunity to learn something new about God. And this came to mind to me maybe about a year ago during the Easter season, when Mary Magdalene encounters Jesus in the garden after the resurrection, and Jesus says, "Mary, do not touch me." That's a difficult passage because I'm not sure what all is going on there, but I think what Mary says before that, she calls him teacher. which is how she knew him, right? As a teacher, as the rabbi. And I think part of what Jesus is saying is that, no, I'm no longer just the teacher or the rabbi. I'm the risen Christ. Like, you're going to relate to me differently now. And you can just imagine the turmoil that the disciples and were in during this time, and just hanging on to something, that they thought they had lost. And then Jesus kind of just flips it around and says, like, don't hang on to me. Like, don't hang on to the old Jesus that you knew. Like, this is the new Jesus. And again, it's this idea of change, right? That there's something new happening. Don't hang on to the old. There's new opportunity. You're going to do bigger and better things than what I ever did. And I don't think they grasped that at that point. But I think that's what Jesus is getting at with this. Don't hang on to me. He's not just talking about physical hanging on. He's talking about don't hang on to the old rabbi teacher idea. There's something new happening. Authentic peace requires both conversion and justice. And this is the idea where Jesus meets the woman accused of adultery by the leaders. Jesus tells her, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. So there's this kind of restorative action, but there's also this kind of justice that's happening. That reconciliation is God's responsibility. That we are ambassadors of God. And this is that verse that I read at the beginning, that we are participate in God's reconciling work, but it's His work. And that reconciliation is a gift to us. So there are different views of peace that we think about. Often when we think of peace, and somebody mentioned, well, I just want peace. We think of peace kind of as being the absence of conflict. And then we call that a negative peace. And so we can say, well, there's no war in this, in the United States. But, there's also a lot of polarity, right? Like it's not at all as peaceful as what it would look. And if people are, in certain countries, and in fact, the land of Judea during Jesus' time appeared to be peaceful, but the people were being oppressed, because the Roman army was maintaining peace. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about peace. What we're talking about peace, we're talking about positive peace, where people's well-being is being taken into consideration. So in the Old Testament, the word for peace is shalom. And it has so many different hues of meaning. It's not just peace, the way that we often use it. It's the idea of peace and prosperity. And prosperity not meaning like, I have, $1 million in my bank account, but prosperity in that, it's raining, and I guess there's lots of prosperity around Allentown today. It's been raining all day ever since I've been here. The family's doing well, the crops are doing well, things are good. Like this idea, life is good. But it's also this idea of being in right relationship, being in right relationship with God, being in right relationship with myself, being in right relationship with my family, being in right relationship with the community, my neighbors, and being in right relationship with the earth, with the world. Like it has all that kind of meaning. So it's not just peace, as we would think about it. But then it also has this meaning of straightforwardness in speech. In other words, we're being honest with each other. I'm not hiding things from you. We're being straightforward. We're speaking truth and love to each other. So all those different hues of meaning are embedded in this idea of shalom in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the word for peace is Irene, and here it has different uses in the New Testament. It has this idea of peace with God, the idea of peace, the peace of God, and the peace of God that transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds. And then this idea of blessed are the peacemakers, this idea of participating in God's work, of bringing peace to the world. So Jesus had some things to say about conflict and on loving our enemies. And we don't think of people in church as our enemies, but too often we kind of treat them that way. We don't treat them as friends, so what does that make them? So Jesus calls us to love our enemies, or to love each other, even if we disagree with each other. And although we don't use that term in describing each other, like that's really kind of how we treat each other. We're called to love our enemies and to pray for them. Not that they see things the way that I do, but that we can see each other's point of view. And then there's this passage in Matthew 18 that we want to look at. We'll go through this, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and go through a few other things this evening yet. So this idea of conflict in the church, Jesus says, if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault, and the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. And I would just preface this to say that I don't see this as a formula necessarily. Like if you follow these steps, everything's going to work out. But these are some ways that we can relate to each other or deal with conflict. And so this is that level where you're kind of just negotiating between two people. If someone offends you, if someone throws the green beans away, go and talk to them about it instead of just stewing about it. Like tell them why the green beans meant so much to you. And then it says, but if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So this is this idea of mediation, bringing someone else to kind of listen and help each other talk about things together. You want to tell your husband why the green beans meant so much. If he's not listening, that kind of thing. Bringing in the mediator. And again, it's not a formula, but these are aspects or different ways of dealing with conflict. And then finally, if the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. And the way that my people have interpreted this is that, well, how do you treat Gentiles and tax collectors? You throw them out of the church, right? You shun them. And I have family members. I still have a lot of Amish cousins that certain families treat each other that way, like they don't eat with each other because they've done something to offend them, and so they're shunned. And they use this verse to kind of as the basis for that. But how did Jesus treat Gentiles and tax collectors? Yeah, he went to them and continued to love them, right? That's kind of a different twist on this verse. And if you think about it, who's writing this? What's that? A tax collector, right? Like, how did Jesus treat Matthew? Like, he took him in. And so, we like to use this, well, we just got to get rid of this person or that person and everything's going to be okay. And I think the challenge here is like, how do you continue loving that person that you don't see eye to eye with? How do you continue staying in relationship with that person? So I think I think that's a really important part of Jesus' message is like you don't just throw people out, you continue to engage with them and to love them. I think we're at break time, we're 2 minutes past. I think we're going to take a break. Do you have any instructions for people? Well, I have a couple instructions. Sorry. While you're on break, on page, and by the way, my slides, a lot of them have like A6 up there. That corresponds to, I should have said this right at the beginning, corresponds to a page in the manual. So you can kind of follow along. I'm not just kind of, I'm sorry, I meant to say that right on that. But as you go to break, and we're going to take a little bit of extra time on B1, there's how do I manage differences? And this is a very simple exercise, but it's not very scientific. For all of you that want a very scientific method, this isn't very scientific. It's just to kind of get you thinking, how do I manage conflict? So the first set of questions up to J are like, how do you kind of respond? How do you act in normal circumstances when things are calm? And then the next set of questions are when the intensity starts to rise and that person is angry at you, you know they're angry at you, how do you respond in those kind of situations? So you're going to circle a number, one being not at all characteristic, and number 6 being very characteristic. And then you're going to transfer those numbers over onto the blue page on B3. So make sure that you get the right, so A will go in this first box here, and that's a calm storm, a calm question. But make sure that you get the correlating numbers with the letters. And then bring the high numbers, like add those numbers up. So let's see. So you're going to, the highest number, oh man, I'm losing it here. So you're going to calculate the highest. Oh, okay, here it is. So put your highest number first, and then down through there. Wow. Have you got it? Okay. If you have questions, I'll be around. I just froze on this. Anyway, you have instructions for break. So we'll take like 20 minutes to give you time to have break and fill this out. It'll be longer than just 15 minutes. So we'll come back at 8:40.
So we just want to say thank you to our Arabic community for providing us with wonderful food. So go enjoy.
Add those numbers, and then the highest column number you put at the top of the column section, and you list them from highest to lowest number. You do the same thing in the storm And so that high number kind of gives you an indication where you might be, how you might deal with conflict. And when we just go over that a little bit, we're going to do something a little bit more in depth. I'm going to give you some homework tonight and tomorrow morning. Each of you should have gotten this friendly style profile. And we'll go over that in a little bit, but these two they're not the same thing. This is more, what you did here is more like how you handle conflict when someone's angry with you. What do you do? Do you avoid it? Kind of, it's putting yourself in that spectrum a little bit. And then looking at how you handle that. The profile is a little bit more along the lines of Myers-Briggs. That's someone, there's some correlations there, but it's how you kind of relate to people. And we'll go over that in a bit. But I want to just go over this. And again, this is not scientific. It's just kind of a self-reflective exercise to think about how do I deal with conflict when it comes up. So there's kind of 5 different categories. There's the directing, there's the cooperating, there's the avoiding, there's the harmonizing, and then there's the compromising person. And you can see on the left side there, the person, the directing person is very concerned about issues, making sure things get done, but not so concerned about relationships. We just need to get things done. And then on the kind of other side of that, the harmonizing person, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, they're not so concerned, they're not concerned about issues really, but they're really concerned about maintaining relationships. Whatever I need to do is to keep the peace. What I need doesn't matter. All that matters is that we keep the peace. So it's that kind of harmonizing person. And then the cooperating person is, they're concerned about both the relationships and the issues. And the avoiding person is not really concerned about the relationship or the issues. So those are kind of extremes, and you can put yourself anywhere in there. And like as we talked about, that can change depending on the situation. It depends on who's involved in the conflict. If I'm, a young person and I'm in conflict with an older person, I might respond differently than a conflict than if it's one of my peers, right? So depending on who's involved, you might respond differently. I might avoid it if I feel like, oh, I'm just going to be cut off or whatever. But if I feel like I'm going to be listened to, I might actually engage. So the person or the situation can really change the way that where we find ourselves in this grid. So the directing person, we sometimes say is they kind of force their way, it's my way. We're going to kind of breeze through this kind of quickly. So I'm going to use an example. So let's say, during the pandemic, some people were working from home. Other people that were maybe in the medical field were working their tails off at, in the healthcare system. And so if I'm working at home, let's say I'm working at home, which I am, and I'm on my chair all day, plunking away at the computer, and my wife, who is working in the healthcare system, which she is not, but let's just imagine that she was, and she's been working hard on her feet all day, and I say, you know what? I've been sitting on, all day, we're gonna go out bowling tonight. You know, I don't care, I just need to get out, we're going out. You know, we don't care what the other person thinks, this is just what I want, what I need, and this is what's gonna happen. This is kind of the directed person. So this can be good in different situations. Sometimes you have to make, decisions on the fly, and you can't wait around for, people to debate things. But if this is kind of the way that you always deal with things, it can, be inappropriate. The next one is the avoiding person. So they just, when conflict comes, they just kind of pull their head into their shell and avoid things. So sometimes we represent that as the turtle. And so if I'm the turtle, I've been working at home all day, and my wife comes home and she's tired, and I say, well, and she wants to stay home and watch a movie, and I want to go out bowling. I would say, oh, well, whatever, and we just stay home, and she watches her movie, and I read a magazine or something, and we don't talk to each other. We just kind of avoid each other because, I don't want to stir the pot, so to speak. So this is kind of that avoiding person. Sometimes it's okay, like you just feel like the issue isn't worth arguing about, so you just avoid it. And sometimes people use this when they feel like, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow when we talk about power and powerlessness in a group. The people, like, I hesitate using those words because I think we all have a certain amount of agency, and sometimes the only voice that we have is to be silent. So it's not like it's never useful, but if this is just how we deal with conflict, like we just kind of hold up, show up, and don't confront people or get involved, it's not a healthy way to deal with conflict. So the harmonizing person, it's kind of the huggable teddy bear. Whatever you want to do, that's fine. Like, I just don't want to, this as long as we get together. So, in this case, my wife comes home and she wants to, watch a movie, and I really want to go. I need to exercise, but what I want to do doesn't matter really. What my wife wants to do, that's what's important. So we do that, and that's okay, right? Occasionally, but if that's what always happens, like I just give in and I don't really say what I want, like that, people can begin to hold that in and resent things, and become, they can build those things up and become resentful. So their view of conflict is that it's disastrous. So it's often kind of the teddy bears that are down at that one end. They just want things to be, really good. I heard, sometimes it's that person that, they're bringing, all the snacks and stuff to the meeting, like just trying to get people to have a good time so that, we avoid any kind of conflict. So often the teddy bear really doesn't care about the issues, or even if they do, what they're really concerned about is the relationships. And so again, like you tend to, if this is your way of dealing with conflict, you end up kind of harboring resentment over time, because you feel like you never get an opportunity to really say what's on your mind. And then there's the cooperating person, kind of the wise old owl. Someone questioned me about why we use the wise old owl, like he's a pretty cunning night predator. I don't know why we use owl as a wise symbol, but anyway, it's kind of in our society that the owl is a wise person. They're collaborative. It's, you know, our way, like they're looking for a win-win situation. They see conflict as kind of natural, and it's neutral. It's not good or bad. It's just part of life. And they recognize that tensions in relationships. They recognize that there are always going to kind of be tensions in relationships, and so they kind of look for, you know, a win-win situation. So again, you know, I'm the owl, and my wife comes home. I've been sitting at the computer all day. She's been working all day. She wants, you know, to stay in, and I want to go out. And so you might come up with some kind of solution. Well, you know, honey, why don't we go to the park, and you can sit on the bench, and I'll walk the dog. I'll play frisbee with the dog or throw the ball to the dog. I'll get my exercise, and you can kind of relax. You don't have to walk around and follow me. You know, so you kind of find it's like a win-win for both of you, like that meets both of your needs. So you try to find a creative solution. So one example of this is that a few years ago, we worked with a church in Milwaukee. They had a large sanctuary, it was an old church, had beautiful woodwork in it. And the young youth pastor wanted to have a contemporary service to kind of draw young people in. And the older people said, no, that, you know, and he wanted a drop-down screen. He says, no, that's really gonna look ugly up there with that beautiful woodwork. And they didn't know what to do. Like they kind of came to a standstill. And you know, the solution was kind of obvious for them. Like, so they asked us to help them put together some kind of a process to help them work through this. And so in the end, they said, well, we'll have our contemporary service, because the traditional people, they wanted people to come too. They wanted, you know, younger families to join, but they really didn't want to mess with the architecture. So they came up with this idea of like, well, we'll put the screen, we'll have someone build us a box that matches the woodwork of the existing church, and the screen will be up in that until we, you know, unless we're using it. And then it'll drop down, and it'll have, the slides will have, you know, reflect the stained glass windows in the church. And it will be, you know, this really beautiful thing. When the screen is up, nobody will really even know it's there. You know, so if they would have looked for a, you know, kind of a compromising way, they said, well, maybe, you know, one Sunday we'll have it, one Sunday we won't. Like, you know, something that's not really satisfying to anyone. But so they came up with this solution that everyone was able to kind of get what they wanted and meet the needs of the church. So that's kind of the collaborative. Like, how can we come together and agree on something that both of us want, both of us need? And then the final one is the compromising, the sly old fox. You kind of come halfway, and the idea that, well, you win some and you lose some. And their view of conflict is that it's mutual differences best resolved by cooperation and compromise. And if each comes halfway, progress can be made by the democratic process. So again, I'm the sly, if I'm the fox, I've been in the computer all day, my wife comes home, she wants to watch a movie, I want to, you know, go to the park or bowling or whatever. You know, if we're compromising, I might say, well, why don't we go bowl for 5 frames and then go catch the second half of the movie? That's not satisfying. So you get to do both, but not really, it's not really satisfying to me. So this idea of coming halfway isn't necessarily, it can be helpful, but not necessarily just to come to an agreement, like it's not always really that helpful. So it can be important when you do have to make a decision. You have to come up with some kind of decision, and you have to move on. But if it's if there are essential decisions, like just to come to a decision is not a good reason to come to a decision. You need to process that and find creative ways to work through those differences. So that's really kind of a quick overview. I don't know where you found yourself on those, but it gives you a little bit of an idea or a sense maybe how you might deal with conflict and some of the pros and cons of that. So what we're going to do, let me check my clock. We have about a half hour left. And what I'm going to do in the last little bit here is go over your friendly style profile. This will be your assignment for tonight. And you can see I'm wearing this little name tag, and you're going to come tomorrow having filled out in your manual. You should have and this is maybe like one of the more important things that we do this weekend. You should have a pull out like this. It has a series of questions that you're going to answer, similar to what you did in this little exercise in the manual, but it's getting at different things. It's more of your how you relate to how you relate to people. And this is really Gilmore Fraley. It's for corporate America, but it really kind of works well in the church setting too. So again, it's this idea of how do we respond to certain situations when it's calm, when it gets stormy. How does that change? Is it the same? Do I react differently? And so you can see that I'm red, and red is affiliating and perfecting. So for me, somebody mentioned that, well, if we're dealing with principles, then I'm down at 10. Well, that's probably me, kind of this is wrong. We've got to deal with this. That would push me down there. If it's not principle, then I'm maybe down more further down the line. So this is for myself. I'm concerned with social justice issues and things like that. Those are things that are really important to me. But if I'm one of these other, so there's the and Tom and I were talking about this a little bit on break. If I'm a driven person, I really want to get things done. I might just push things through. I don't really care what other people think. I just want to get it done. And I can maybe kind of overstep my bounds a bit by doing that. And then you have, the blues that are kind of analyzing, they really want to know, well, why are we doing this? Isn't there a better way to do this? And there's probably blues in here thinking, well, why is he doing this or why is he doing that? There's a better way of doing this. So maybe kind of I don't know, there might be engineers in here or something like that are kind of in this analyzing position, like, no, this really could be done better. And then there are the, what's the other one? The accommodating person, kind of that teddy bear, like they're really just working at holding people together. So, we're in a setting like this, and all I'm concerned about, somebody has a birthday today, we should sing happy birthday to them, like, let's have a party here. That's kind of the accommodating person. They just want to make sure that, everybody's having a good time, and they're not really, pushing these other things. They're not pushing things through. So this is really helpful in thinking about, well, why do some people respond differently to the same situation? Why does that person seem to be kind of distant? And maybe that they're not distant at all. They're actually just really kind of sitting back and thinking, well, what is really happening here? And another person is, really pushing to get things done. Why are they so just driven to get things done? Well, just understanding like how different people approach these kinds of issues is really helpful. I think the phrase you used, Tom, is know thyself. Like in knowing thyself, like you can also kind of know and understand how other people might be functioning or so forth. So this is also kind of that self-reflective exercise and understanding, like, how do I respond? Do I sit back and analyze? Well, this is really, I'm really set on this principle. And I'm going to dig in my feet and make sure that justice is served. That approach, or am I just concerned that everybody is getting along? Like, why doesn't that person ever, engage meaningfully? Why are they just always, wanting to have a party? So again, and we'll go over this more in the morning. We'll come back and talk about it. You're going to have a chance to, when you come back in the morning, you're going to bring this word pamphlet with you, and in the end, you'll end up scoring yourself. Again, you'll put the scores from your you put all the scores back, so there's an AA, and you put the AA in the right place there, whatever you scored. So, for example, as compared to other people, I seem to be more aware of what others would like to do and willing to fit in with their plans. Does that describe you, or are you more cautious and reasonable and practical before I get involved in most activities? So I sit back and I kind of think about things like, is that really something I want to get involved in? Am I more likely to come up with ideas for what to do and usually convince others to join me? In other words, if I can get a bunch of people behind me to achieve this, whatever it is. I just want to be a close and special friend who can speak up and support someone's ideas. So you're just supportive, like, of other people. So whatever, you list those from whichever is the highest, you would put, whichever describes you the best, you would put as 4. Is that right, Jan? Yeah. So you put, thank you. So you put the highest number, that best describes you as 4, and the lowest number as 1. And then you transfer all of those to the back, and you total them up, and then you put those down on the bottom. And that gives you your score. And so you'll hand these in. You'll probably want to put your name on them. And then we're going to create name tags. What's interesting is, so the top number here is your column number, how you, in normal circumstances, how you relate to people. The bottom one is your, when things kind of get rough and tensions begin to rise. But what's interesting is that these aren't necessarily going to match up. So Jan over there has a green one on the top. When things are calm, is that directive, Jan? Achieving directive. And when things get rough, it's analyzing and preserving. So you might have, and it can be, in some cases, it can be tricolor. Like these two, you might have two 27s, or I put as the two numbers at top. And so we would create a name tag that kind of describes a little bit of who you are. And what you're going to do then is sit in groups together. So all the greens are going to go to one place, and you're going to talk about what it's like to be a green person. Yeah. And the reds are going to be with reds. Thank you, Jan. And the yellows with yellows. And so, right away, certain things are going to happen in those groups, right? Like the greens are going to be done in like 5 minutes. Going through their assignment. The yellows, they're going to sit around and talk a while, and what were we supposed to do? And the reds were saying, well, this isn't right. This isn't fair. There's and the blues are going to analyze. This really isn't a good way to go about this. So anyway, you're going to have those conversations, then you're going to come back and report on it, because then you're going to begin to see like, oh, I see their part. They're wearing a green tag or they're wearing a red tag. I can kind of understand why maybe they. And you'll talk about like the strengths of this, but like what happens when that kind of turns into an excess. And that's kind of where we end up sometimes in conflict, is that these strengths turn into excesses. And then, that's where the conflict can be created. So, any questions about this here? And I would encourage you to, I know it's late, and we're going to get back together pretty early in the morning. But at the very minimum, fill, like if you want to be involved tomorrow, like it's really important to fill this out. Like this is like good stuff. It's good conversation. And we'll use that. We'll actually end up collecting the name tags. We're going to keep them because we want all of you to come back to the small group listening sessions that are planned for the end of the month, and we're going to wear these things in those groups. And so then we can begin to say, listen, as we're listening to each other, we're kind of also saying, oh, I can kind of understand why they might have that view of things. So we won't let you throw these things in the trash. We're going to keep them. Any questions that you have? And if you can read some of the manual, that'd be great. But at least do the profile, and then when you come back, we're going to be set up. Jan and Stephen and Taylor and I are going to be set up. I don't know. We'll have a table somewhere where you're going to drop these off, and we're going to create your name tag for you. You've got a whole box of them up here. And we'll figure out what your score, well, you'll have figured out your scores, and we'll figure out how to put the name tags together. And any questions about any of that? And for those of you on Zoom, I think you have digital copies of these, right? Yeah. And so you can also fill those out and kind of be aware of what your score is. Okay. Yeah, they can send a picture to us, text a picture to us of their score, and then we can create a name tag for them as well. Maybe they can hang that in their screen somewhere so people can see it. Any questions? Well, I think we're going to stop there and give you time. You're going to need, you can begin to work on it a little bit here if you want to. And then if you have questions, I'll be around. Jan's done this before. She can answer questions as well. But we'll just wrap up the last, there's like 10 minutes till 9:30, which is when we're scheduled in, to begin working on that. And if you have questions, we'll be around. So yeah, go ahead and start filling those out, and then we'll dismiss that 9:30. Thank you.
Still trying to copy it down and